preaching series. But this week we are back into it with Jesus and Atonement, A New Hope Redux, which pairs up with the first Sunday in Lent last year. And this week we explore the most commonly held and widely known theory of atonement, which is called substitutionary atonement. Indeed, for some teachers and pastors, this is the only one that matters. I encourage you, even if you haven't for any of the others, to go back and watch last year's version of this one to see what isn't included this time around. Now, this is going to be a very risky sermon, as I am going to deconstruct this theory a bit, but with the intent of rebuilding it again in a way which is, please God, more life-giving and theologically sound than what we may have internalized. And it is important to rebuild in a positive way and not just deconstruct, as I would hate for this sermon to be validly titled Father Brett Ruins Your Favourite Atonement Theory. So to begin, the core pieces of the theory will be familiar to most of us. There is creation. Humanity and everything else in creation has fallen through the actions of Adam and Eve. We are, by virtue of being descendants of Adam and Eve, inherently sinful. From that sinful nature arise sinful actions, and it basically means that pain and suffering and evil and all that stuff has taken hold in the world. Humankind cannot remedy this situation because God is perfect and sinless, and that which is imperfect and sinful cannot by itself achieve perfection. Like Paul is lamenting in his letter to the church of Philippi. He is blameless before God in so many ways, but so being sinful, our eternal destiny would be at least separation from God, because sin is incompatible with God. And some go so far as to say there is eternal conscious torment, i.e. hell, involved too. But for a time in history, there was a system of dealing with sin, managed through the temple in Jerusalem by God's chosen people, where sacrifices were made which stand between God and us and our sinful nature and actions. God the Father actually does love humankind, even though in this scheme, love is also somehow compatible with divine torment. And God does not intend the breach in relationship to last forever. So even though plan A failed, that's Adam and Eve, there is a plan B. Enter Jesus the Son, fully human and fully divine. And because of that fully divine nature, that somehow seizes on the human nature and carries it along as a representative for all of us. So through Jesus' death on the cross, the debt of human sin is finally and totally paid. The wrath and anger of God against all of us is satisfied through the death of Jesus as our intermediary. And he takes the beating which God has decided we all deserve. Ultimately, Jesus is risen as the victor over sin and death, and through our conscious act of confessing faith, that is, belief and trust, that this is a real account of the problem of humanity, that Jesus has done what he did for this particular reason, and he was who he was, we are saved. So by our confession of belief and trust and faith, we become Christ's own people. We're saved from death and hell, and we get to join the eternal party in heaven. And that is the story which is at the heart of substitutionary atonement. And in many ways, it is very solidly founded on biblical authority and teaching. Christ died for our sins in accordance with the scriptures. Christ gave himself up as a ransom for many. He is our great high priest and sacrifice. And maybe that all sits pretty well with you. But there are many deeply faithful Christians, including me, who have some questions about this, even though, admittedly, it's quite a tidy scenario, and it's very easy for an evangelist to engage with, and the case is clearly presented through a few choice biblical passages. So the missionary strategy is to basically highlight how a person is fundamentally and eternally flawed, basically doomed, and that there is a solution of it through Jesus. But I think it's fear-based at its core. And whilst it may make us very grateful to Jesus, it could make us very wary of the God he called Father, who seems to want to slaughter us all, but is satisfied when his beloved Son is killed on our behalf, and thus can avert this murderous wrath. Sometimes, some people flagging that they may be in mortal peril before God could be just the right approach and entirely appropriate if their evil deeds are off the charts. But for many, and I hope this resonates with you, I want to recast this approach of how Jesus saves in a way which is more like beckoning you towards the light and love which are at the heart of God the Father and is made known to us through Jesus the Son. Because that is important. God does love us. And God so loves us that through Jesus we are gifted with life, even when we were utterly hostile to God. So let's rebuild this, and I need to acknowledge a significant intellectual debt at this point, as I'm going to draw on a book called Pauline Dogmatics, published in 2020 by Douglas Campbell. And when I read his approach to this, it was like my soul was singing in affirmation. So I hope it speaks to you similarly. So here's the headlines of the retelling of the story we have just heard. But we still start with Genesis and the fundamental problem of humanity and creation and the reality of sin and death that is outlined. And I can't say it any better than Campbell, so I'm just going to quote directly at this point. Death is God's solution to sin because it is God's judgment on sin. God judges sin by refusing to give it a future. It is judged as sin and as unworthy of continuation and hence of life. The causality in this judgment is significant, however. God does not actively inflict an event of death in an act of judgment on those who sin. The Father did not execute the Son and does not execute us either. The process is, in a sense, rather more passive than this. That causality is incredibly important. That is the difference between God actively inflicting wrath and death and torment, and the difference between that and a passive judgment on sin itself. So in other words, we've still got sin, and life, including us, is contaminated with sin and evil, and God judges that that is the case and will not allow that to continue. And this approach, it still makes really good sense of so many of the biblical texts which supports the former approach. That which is sinful dies, and everything dies, so death is the solution to sin because it brings it to an end in finite beings. But then, what about the problem of death, which runs just as counter to God, who is the author of life? Because whilst we may affirm it is good that evil and sin is extinguished, it's appalling in its termination of that which is good. And ultimately, God longs for eternal communion with us in the Lord created and loves. So when God the Son is made incarnate in Jesus and is crucified and dies, our human nature dies with him as our representative. But in Jesus, our humanity is then resurrected, raised to life as a new creation. So the death and resurrection of Jesus the Christ thus become God's answer to the problem of sin and also death. The resurrection of Jesus marks the victory and the termination of death. So in this take on the atonement, God is absolutely faithful and covenantal all the way through, is good all the way through, and lives and suffers the consequences of sin and dies, all for the sake of love for us, that we might be raised with Christ. So God still does judge sin and refuses to give it life in the future, but then takes that judgment on himself and bears it to create a path for us out of it. So Doug Campbell has some great things to say about the resurrection as well and what that means for us in the here and now, and that may get a mention at Easter. But for now, I pray that having those two models of substitutionary atonement outlined has stirred something within you. And I really pray that the something which is stirred is a newly dawning awareness of just how much God does love each of us and the significance of Jesus' life and death and resurrection. And that inspires a response of faith within you and a desire to walk in his blessed footsteps, following his path. There is no journey quite like it, but it is the way, the truth, and the life. And the life is eternal. It's so